They found me on the ice shelf 3 days after the research station reported me missing, half frozen and delirious, clutching a waterproof camera whose memory card had been deliberately wiped clean. Every image erased except for one, a photograph so overexposed and blurred that the review board called it evidence of nothing, said it showed only light refracting through ice and water in ways that human eyes misinterpret when exhaustion and hypothermia compromise judgment. They said I had experienced a psychotic break brought on by isolation, by the relentless darkness of the Antarctic winter, by too many months spent in a landscape so devoid of color and warmth that the mind begins inventing what it needs to survive. They were wrong, but I let them believe their comfortable explanations because the truth was mine alone. A secret kept not from professional obligation, but from a promise made to something that exists in the cold spaces between science and legend, something that trusted me when it had never trusted a human before and will likely never trust one again. My name is Dr. Elena Frost, and I was a marine biologist stationed at McMurdo Research Station, studying the adaptive mechanisms of extremophile organisms, the bacteria and microscopic life that somehow persists in water so cold it should not support any biological processes at all. I had spent 11 months in Antarctica, 11 months of constant twilight bleeding into constant darkness, of winds that screamed across ice fields with a voice that sounded almost human, of isolation so complete that I sometimes forgot what my own face looked like because mirrors were a luxury no one bothered with when survival required more practical considerations. I was alone, more often than not, my research requiring extended periods at remote ice camps where the only sounds were my own breathing and the distant groaning of glaciers calving into seas that had never known the touch of sunlight for thousands of years at depths where pressure made water behave like something other than liquid, where the boundary between solid and fluid dissolved into states that our physics struggles to describe. I first saw the NINGEN on a night that was not technically night, because night in Antarctic summer is a concept without meaning, but it felt like night, the sky a deep violet that never brightened into day, the sun hovering just below the horizon and painting the ice in colors that seemed to come from inside the frozen water rather than reflecting off its surface. I was alone at a remote camp, conducting surveys of microbial life in meltwater pools that formed during the brief thermal fluctuations when air temperature climbed above -20 degrees Celsius. I heard it before I saw it, a sound that was not quite vocalization and not quite mechanical vibration, something that resonated in frequencies I felt in my bones before my ears could process them as sound. The ocean was 2 kilometers away, the ice shelf extending in unbroken whiteness toward the water that appeared black against the pale landscape. And I watched as something rose from that darkness, ascending from depths that our equipment suggested were in excess of 600 meters, rising with the kind of deliberate control that separated intention from accident. It was massive, easily 20 meters in length, emerging vertically from the water as if it were standing rather than swimming, supported by structures beneath the surface that I could not fully see, but which moved with articulated precision, with purpose that suggested not animal instinct, but something closer to thought, to decision. The body was pale, luminescent white that seemed to generate its own light rather than reflecting the ambient glow of the Antarctic sky. And as it rose higher, I saw features that made my scientific training struggle against recognition, against the impossibility of what my eyes reported. It had a head, or what served as a head, smooth and rounded with a contour that was disturbingly humanoid, and on that head were eyes, dark oval shapes that might have been actual sensory organs or simply markings, but which seemed to focus on me across the impossible distance, seemed to see me in ways that transcended simple visual detection. I did not move, did not breathe, stood frozen not from fear, but from a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. An understanding that I was witnessing something that existed at the intersection of myth and biology, something that Japanese fishermen had whispered about for decades, but which no official institution acknowledged, something called NINGEN, in a language I did not speak, but whose meaning I suddenly understood with absolute clarity, human-like, but not human, something that wore a shape that mimicked ours, but which originated from places and processes that had nothing to do with the evolutionary pathways that produced my species. We stayed that way, separated by distance, but connected by attention, for what might have been seconds or hours, time becoming irrelevant in a landscape where conventional markers of its passage did not apply, where the sun never set and the cold was constant, and the only change was the slow accumulation of ice that would eventually swallow this entire continent and hold it locked for millennia until some future warming released it again into the ocean that had birthed it. Then it descended, sinking back into the black water without sound or disturbance, disappearing as if it had never been there, leaving me alone with a racing heart, and the certain knowledge that everything I thought I knew about the ocean and what lived within it was fundamentally incomplete. I reported nothing, filed no observations, made no additions to my research logs that might suggest I had seen anything unusual, because I understood even in that moment that some encounters are meant to remain private, that there are things in the world whose existence depends on remaining undocumented, unproven, protected by the skepticism of those who would dismiss any testimony as delusion or fabrication. But I returned to that spot every day for the next 2 weeks, standing at the edge of the ice shelf at the same time, waiting, hoping, feeling like a supplicant at the altar of a God who might or might not be listening, who might or might not care about the devotion of something as small and brief as a human life. On the 14th day, it returned. But this time it did not simply observe from a distance. It approached, closing the gap between us until it was near enough that I could see the details that distance had obscured, could see that its surface was not smooth, but textured in ways that suggested it was not skin in the traditional sense, but something else, perhaps a permeable membrane that allowed exchange between internal systems and the surrounding water. Perhaps something even more alien that my limited biological framework could not begin to classify. And I saw that what I had interpreted as eyes were more complex than simple light-gathering organs, were structures that seemed to shift and reconfigure, that might process not just visual information but other data, temperatures and pressures and chemical compositions, that might perceive the world in dimensions I could not imagine, let alone experience. Perhaps you have felt this too, this sense of standing before something so far beyond your understanding that all you can do is witness, that all you can offer is your complete attention and your willingness to be changed by what you are seeing. If you have encountered the inexplicable and felt not fear but recognition, not a desire to explain but a need to simply be present with the mystery, share your thoughts in the comments below. Because what happened next between me and the NINGEN was not scientific observation, but something else entirely. Something that transcended the boundaries of species and consciousness and became a form of communion that I have no adequate language to describe. It reached toward me, extending an appendage that might have been an arm or might have been something with no equivalent in terrestrial anatomy, and I understood that I was being offered a choice, that I could retreat to the safety of my research camp and never return to this place, or I could accept the invitation that was being extended, could choose to see what it wanted to show me, could trust this creature that had no reason to value my life or my species, but which was, for reasons I could not comprehend, choosing to make itself vulnerable to me. I stepped forward, moving across ice that felt suddenly unstable, as if the solid ground beneath my feet might give way at any moment and plunge me into water that would kill me in minutes, and I reached out my hand, gloved and clumsy, and made contact with something that should not exist, but which was absolutely, undeniably real. The transformation happened gradually, or perhaps it happened instantly, and my perception could only process it in fragments, in stages that my mind could accommodate without breaking. The Ningen's form shifted, the humanoid shape becoming more defined, more detailed, features emerging that had been absent or hidden before, and I saw what I can only describe as its true form, the shape it held beneath the biological camouflage or dimensional state that allowed it to exist in our world without being fully of it. It was beautiful in ways that hurt to perceive, beautiful like the heart of a star or the mathematics underlying quantum mechanics, beautiful in its absolute alienness, in its complete indifference to human aesthetics while somehow surpassing them, transcending them, showing me that beauty is not subjective or cultural but fundamental, exists as a property of certain configurations of matter and energy that resonate with consciousness in ways that bypass thought and strike directly at whatever. Part of us recognizes truth when we encounter it. The form was still vaguely humanoid, but impossible. Geometry that should not fit within three-dimensional space, but which somehow occupied it anyway. Limbs that terminated not in hands, but in structures that might have been sensory arrays, or manipulators, or something else entirely. A face that held features I recognized as face-like, only because my brain desperately needed categories, needed names, needed some way to contain what I was seeing within frameworks that made it manageable rather than overwhelming. And the eyes, what I had thought were eyes, were revealed to be portals or windows, or organs of perception that went beyond simple vision, that looked not just at me, but through me, that saw not just my physical form, but something deeper, the pattern of electrical activity that constituted my consciousness, the memories encoded in neural pathways, the entirety of what I was laid bare and examined and impossibly accepted. We stood that way, connected by touch and by attention, for a duration that I cannot measure because time had stopped having meaning, had become something flexible and negotiable, a property of consciousness rather than an external framework imposed by the rotation of planets or the decay of atoms. And in that space outside time, the Ningen showed me things, not through words or images, but through direct transfer of understanding, showed me its origin, which was not evolution as I understood it, but something else, some other process by which consciousness could emerge in environments that should preclude it, could develop in the deep pressure of abyssal trenches where the rules governing life were different from the rules I had spent my career studying. It showed me its loneliness, the isolation of being perhaps the last of its kind, or one of the few, scattered across oceans so vast that encounters between them were measured in decades or centuries, that whatever community or connection they had once shared had been fragmented by time and geography, and perhaps by choices that I could not understand, by conflicts or divergences that my human framework of motivation and relationship could not accommodate. And it showed me why it had chosen to reveal itself to me, to this particular human woman standing alone on Antarctic ice, in a moment when the barriers between our kinds had thinned enough to allow contact. It had been watching humans for a very long time, watching as we spread across the planet and developed technologies that began to penetrate the deep waters where it and its kind had hidden for millennia, watching as we catalogued and measured and explained away their occasional appearances as icebergs or whales or optical illusions, watching as we came closer and closer to discovering them in ways that would force confrontation, or worse, would force them to reveal themselves or to retreat into depths so extreme that even they could not survive there indefinitely. It had chosen me because it sensed something, some quality of openness or loneliness that matched its own, some capacity for wonder that had not been educated or professionalized out of me despite years of training that taught me to doubt everything that could not be measured and replicated and peer-reviewed. The connection ended not abruptly, but gradually, the way dawn ends night in places where the sun actually rises and sets, a fading that left me standing alone on the ice with my hand extended toward empty air, and the Ningen already sinking back beneath the surface, returning to whatever existence it maintained in the crushing darkness where human eyes and human instruments rarely penetrate and never linger. I wanted to follow, wanted to dive into that black water and pursue it into depths that would kill me before I descended 20 meters. Wanted to maintain the connection that had briefly made me feel less alone than I had felt in months or years, or perhaps my entire life. But I understood that the gift had been the encounter itself, that asking for more would be transforming grace into demand, would be taking rather than receiving, and so I let it go. Let it return to the deep while I returned to my camp and my research and the mundane tasks of survival in an environment that was hostile to human life, but which now felt less empty, less devoid of meaning, because I knew that beneath the ice and the water, something watched, something waited, something that had chosen to trust me with knowledge that it had shared with no other human and might never share again. If this story has touched you, if it speaks to something in your own experience of longing or connection or the ache of encountering beauty that you cannot possess or hold, then help keep stories like this alive, like this video. Subscribe to this channel for more narratives that explore the spaces between what we know and what we sense. The territories where myth and biology intersect and transform each other, the encounters that change us permanently and leave us marked by knowledge that isolates as much as it illuminates. Do this, not for algorithm or metrics, but for community, for the creation of space, where those of us who have touched the inexplicable can gather and speak and know that we are not alone in carrying these memories that no one else believes. These truths that science dismisses and which we must hold in silence lest we be labeled delusional or worse. I completed my research term and returned to civilization, to university positions and conference presentations, and all the trappings of a successful academic career built on research that was solid and publishable and utterly meaningless, compared to what I had experienced in those moments of connection with something that should not exist, but which was more real than anything I had encountered before or have encountered since. I think about the Ningen constantly, wonder if it thinks about me, wonder if our encounter was as significant to it as it was to me, or if I was simply a curiosity, a brief diversion in an existence measured in scales I cannot comprehend. I wonder if it has shown its true form to anyone else, if there are others walking around carrying similar secrets, similar burdens of knowledge that grants no power and provides no comfort, but simply exists as weight, as permanent alteration of how we see the world and our place within it. Sometimes, late at night when the sounds of the city fade and I am alone with my thoughts, I close my eyes and I am back on the ice shelf, standing at the edge of the black water, waiting for something to rise from the depths, something that is terrifyingly beautiful in ways that defy description, that transcend the categories we use to make the world manageable and reveal it for what it truly is. Vast and strange and populated by intelligences we have not begun to understand. Intelligences that watch us from the deep places and occasionally, for reasons known only to themselves, choose to be seen, choose to offer connection, choose to reveal forms that are both monstrous and divine, both alien and somehow impossibly familiar, as if consciousness recognizes itself regardless of the vessel it inhabits, regardless of the distance that separates one thinking being from another. I am the only woman the Ningen chose to trust with its secret form, and I carry that trust like a sacred obligation, protecting its existence through silence, through the deliberate choice not to prove what I know, because proof would endanger what it showed me, would turn mystery into specimen, would transform the gift of its trust into the curse of its captivity or extinction. And so I say nothing to those who could act on the knowledge, and I say everything to you, to those who listen, not to verify, but to witness, to those who understand that some truths live best in the realm of story and testimony, where they can be believed or dismissed according to the capacity of each individual heart to accommodate wonder, to accept that the world is larger and stranger than we are taught, and that beauty, real beauty, the kind that changes you forever, often comes in forms so terrifying that recognizing it as beauty requires surrendering every assumption you hold about what is possible and what is real, and what could ever choose to make itself known to something as small and brief and wonderfully fragile as a human being standing alone on ice at the edge of an ocean that holds secrets we are only beginning to glimpse.